The Irish aren't who they think they are, and neither are you. In 2023, a team of geneticists published a paper that quietly detonated everything we thought we knew about the origins of one of Europe's most iconic peoples. They compared Irish DNA, ancient and modern, to samples from every corner of the continent, and what came back wasn't confirmation of the old story. It was a completely different story. One that reaches back further than the Celts, further than farming, all the way to a time when Ireland was barely habitable, and the people who first walked onto that island were carrying genes from places nobody expected. So let's talk about what they actually found, because this isn't just about Ireland, this is about where all of us came from. When most people think about the Irish, they think about a specific image: red hair, green eyes, pale skin, Celtic mythology, Gaelic language, ancient warrior culture. Maybe a little leprechaun thrown in. The story that's been told for centuries in schools, in national identity, in street Patrick's Day parades from Dublin to Boston is that the Irish are the Celts. That Celtic tribes swept across Europe from somewhere in Central Europe around 600 BCE, settled the British Isles, and became the ancestors of the modern Irish, Scottish, and Welsh. It's a clean story. It feels ancient, it feels proud. It's also wrong. Or at least, it's a tiny sliver of a much longer and more complicated truth. Here's what genetics has done in the last 15 years that archaeology and linguistics couldn't do alone. It let us actually read the biological memory of the dead. Ancient DNA, extracted from bones, from teeth, from the petrous bone behind the ear, that dense little chunk of skull that preserves genetic material better than almost anything else, has given scientists a direct line into the past. Not interpretations, not artifacts, actual biological code, written by people who lived thousands of years ago and left it behind inside their own bodies. And when researchers applied this technology to Irish remains and then compared those results systematically to ancient and modern DNA from across Europe, what they found cracked the foundation of everything. Let's start at the very beginning. The earliest humans to reach Ireland arrived around 10,500 years ago, just after the last ice age. Ireland had been completely buried under glaciers for millennia. When the ice finally retreated, it left behind a landscape that was slowly being colonized by plants and animals, and eventually, people. These first arrivals were hunter-gatherers. They came from a population that had refuged somewhere in southwestern Europe during the Ice Age, probably the Iberian Peninsula, modern-day Spain and Portugal, and then spread north and east as the climate warmed. Geneticists call them Western hunter-gatherers, or WHGs. Now here's where it gets interesting. When scientists extracted DNA from a woman buried in a cave in County Clare known as Cheddar Woman's Irish equivalent, essentially her genetic profile was striking. She had dark skin, dark hair, blue eyes. This wasn't a mistake or an anomaly. This was entirely consistent with what we now know about Western hunter-gatherers across Europe. Pale skin, it turns out, is not some ancient European trait. It evolved later, under selection pressure from low UV environments and vitamin D scarcity. The very first Irish people would have looked nothing like the modern Irish. That's already a lot to sit with. But the hunter-gatherers didn't stay alone on that island for long. Around 6,000 years ago, something massive happened. Farming arrived. Not invented, locally imported, along with an entirely new population of people. These were early European farmers, or EEFs. They came originally from Anatolia, which is modern-day Turkey, and they had been spreading across Europe for thousands of years by the time they reached the British Isles. They brought cattle, sheep, wheat, barley. They built megalithic monuments, the kind that are still standing in Ireland today. Newgrange, the passage tomb in County Meath that's older than Stonehenge, older than the Great Pyramids that was built by these Anatolian-descended farmers, not by Celts, not by the ancestors of the modern Irish in any simple sense, by people whose closest genetic relatives at the time of construction were living in the Eastern Mediterranean. Think about that for a second. The most iconic prehistoric monument in Ireland was built by people who were genetically more similar to populations in modern Turkey and the Levant than to anyone we'd call Irish today. But even that's not the final layer. Around 4,500 years ago, roughly 2,500 BCE, another population began moving into Europe from the Eurasian steppe. These are called the Yamnaya, or their descendants, the corded ware people. They came from the grasslands north of the Black and Caspian Seas. They were semi-nomadic pastoralists. They had horses. They had wheeled vehicles. They almost certainly spoke the ancestral language that would eventually branch into Sanskrit, Greek, Latin, Germanic, Celtic, Slavic, every Indo-European language spoken today. And they were genetically distinct from everyone already in Europe. They carried a mutation for lactase persistence, the ability to digest milk into adulthood that became one of the most powerful selective advantages in European prehistory. They carried Y chromosome haplogroups that are now among the most common in Europe, and they moved fast. Within a few centuries, they had transformed the genetic makeup of the British Isles so dramatically that modern researchers describe it as a near total population replacement. In some regions, ancient DNA shows that steppe ancestry went from essentially 0 to over 50%, sometimes over 70% within just a few generations. This wasn't gradual assimilation. This was something more abrupt. Whether it was violence, disease, or demographic displacement, the record shows that these newcomers didn't just mix with the existing population, they replaced much of it. And this is where the comparison with other European nations becomes fascinating. When the scientists in this study took modern Irish DNA and ancient Irish DNA and mapped it against every other European country, a clear picture emerged. The Irish today carry a particularly high proportion of steppe ancestry, higher than most southern European populations, roughly comparable to populations in Scandinavia, the Baltic states, and parts of northern and eastern Europe. They also retain a meaningful proportion of Western hunter-gatherer ancestry, in fact, comparatively more than many other Western European populations. And their early European farmer component, that Anatolian layer, is lower than you'd find in populations closer to the Mediterranean. What does that mean in plain language? It means that genetically, the modern Irish are not most closely related to the people most popularly imagined as their ancestors. They're not primarily descended from Celtic-speaking Gauls. The Celtic languages and culture came later, and the genetic picture is actually much older and more complex. The Irish population is, in a deep genetic sense, a palimpsest, a manuscript that's been written over again and again, with each old layer still partially visible beneath the new one. Now, here's where this study did something other studies hadn't done as comprehensively. It went country by country, systematically, not just broad European clusters. Actual national-level comparisons, and some of the results were genuinely surprising. The closest modern European genetic relatives to the Irish, according to this analysis, are not the Welsh or the Scots, though those populations are indeed close. They're not the Bretons of northwestern France, though Breton populations also cluster nearby. The closest matches in terms of overall genetic distance include populations from the Baltic and parts of Scandinavia, not because the Irish and Norwegians share some recent historical connection, but because both populations experienced similar patterns of migration and ancestry, high steppe input, significant WHG retention, relatively lower EEF. The convergence is archaeological and demographic, not cultural. This doesn't mean the Irish are secretly Scandinavian. Genetics doesn't work that way. It means that when you strip away language and culture and mythology and look at the raw biological signal, the patterns of human migration create surprising overlaps. People who ended up very far apart geographically can share deep ancestral commonalities because they were shaped by the same ancient forces. Meanwhile, populations like the Sardinians, who are often used in genetic studies as a reference population for early European farmers, are surprisingly genetically distant from modern Irish people. Not because of anything that happened recently, because the Sardinians were largely bypassed by that massive Bronze Age steppe migration, they retained a much higher proportion of Anatolian farmer ancestry. They are, in a sense, a living window into what pre-Bronze Age European genetics looked like. And the modern Irish, despite being on an island at the western edge of Europe, are genetically quite far from that pre-Bronze Age picture. And what about the Celts? Where does Celtic culture actually fit into all of this? This is one of the most contested questions in European prehistory right now, and the genetic evidence has reframed the debate entirely. For a long time, the dominant theory was the Celtic from the West hypothesis, the idea that Celtic languages originated in the Atlantic Bronze Age, spreading from the Iberian Peninsula and France into Britain and Ireland. Under this model, the Celts were essentially autochthonous to Western Europe, not invaders from the East. The genetic data has complicated this theory significantly. There's now strong evidence that at least some of the ancestry associated with Celtic-speaking populations does trace back to Bronze Age migrations from the steppe or from intermediate populations in Central Europe. But it's not clean. The Celtic label has always been more of a linguistic and cultural designation than a genetic one, and the people who ended up speaking Celtic languages were already a mixture of all those earlier layers. The genetics doesn't let you point to a single Celtic source population because there wasn't one. What it does show is that Ireland, despite being an island, despite being geographically isolated at the far western edge of Europe, was not isolated from these massive demographic upheavals. Wave after wave of migration reached it. People moved further and faster and in greater numbers than anyone imagined before ancient DNA was possible. And there's another finding in this research that deserves its own moment: the famous red hair. That almost mythological association between Irish identity and red hair, it turns out to be genuinely old. The MC1R gene variants that produce red hair have been detected in ancient Irish remains going back thousands of years. Red hair isn't a modern quirk or a Norse Viking contribution or a random genetic drift. It appears to have been present in the population since at least the Bronze Age, possibly earlier. Whether it was particularly common among the original steppe migrants, or whether it was selected for by the low UV, overcast environment of Ireland and the British Isles, or some combination of both, scientists are still working that out. But the red hair is real, and it's genuinely ancient. That's one piece of the popular mythology that the genetics actually supports. Now let's zoom out for a second, because there's a bigger question underneath all of this. Why does it matter? Why does it matter who the ancient Irish were, genetically? Why does it matter which Bronze Age steppe people contributed most to their genome? It's 4,000 years ago. Nobody alive today was there. Here's why it matters. Because the stories we tell about where we come from shape how we think about who we are, who belongs, and who doesn't. National identity is built on origin myths. Those myths get weaponized, sometimes subtly, sometimes violently. The idea of Celtic racial purity, the idea of an indigenous population that was there from time immemorial, the idea that any people, anywhere, is descended in a straight, unbroken line from some ancient, homogeneous ancestor group. The genetics says that idea is a fantasy. Every population in Europe, every single one, is a layered mixture of people who came from somewhere else, multiple somewheres, at multiple times, under circumstances ranging from peaceful trade to catastrophic displacement. The Irish are no different, and in a way, knowing that is liberating, because it means that human identity has never been about blood purity. It's never been about a single origin. It's been about what accumulates over time, the languages that survive, the stories that get passed down, the culture that a community builds across generations, regardless of where the genetic input originally came from. The people who built Newgrange were not Irish in any cultural sense, but Newgrange is Irish now. That's what time does. Genetics is also telling us something profound about resilience. Ireland has been through invasion, colonization, famine, diaspora. The island has been remade again and again, and yet something persists. Not in DNA. DNA shuffles and mixes and can't carry a culture, but in language, in music, in the specific way Irish English still carries cadences and grammatical structures from Old Irish. In the stories, the human capacity to maintain identity across biological disruption is extraordinary. And the genetic record of Ireland is proof of that, because the biology changed dramatically multiple times, and yet a recognizable Irish culture emerged and survived. The scientists who did this work weren't trying to make a political point. They were trying to understand the past with the best tools available to them, but the implications ripple outward in every direction, toward nationalism, toward immigration debates, toward the question of what it even means to belong somewhere. And here's what I keep coming back to. Every time a new ancient DNA study comes out, and they're coming faster now, as the technology improves and the sample sizes grow, it says essentially the same thing. The story was always more complicated than the simple version. The simple version is always wrong. Not completely wrong, but wrong in ways that matter. So, if you want to understand where the Irish came from, the honest answer is Turkey, the Eurasian steppe, the Iberian glacial refuge. And then, later, Scandinavia and Wales and Anglo-Saxon England and Norman France, and the whole complicated, violent, tender mess of recorded history. The Irish are everyone, like all of us. If this kind of thing fascinates you, the way science digs up stories the ground has been keeping secret for thousands of years, then stick around. There's a lot more where this came from. Hit subscribe if you want to be here for the next one. And drop a comment below. I'm genuinely curious. Did any of this change how you think about identity, about ancestry, about what it means to belong somewhere? Because I read every single one. And some of the best conversations I've had have started right there in the comments section. See you in the next one.